Hello, I'm Mantastic and Fantastic, and today I'm going to be talking about the PvP meta changes, creating powerful dungeons, as well as building lethal combinations after version 1.8. So, version 1.8 did see numerous changes come to fruition. Most notably is that there are now 2 colors being buffed in Dungeon Defense, as well as 2 stats. So now we basically have significantly wider pool to draw upon in order to populate our dungeon defense, as well as having the ability to combo dot promote various creatures, so you can actually create more 4 dot style defenses, as well as even attackers actually having the ability to reroll their combo dots into the ideal compositions. So this article will be explaining my thought process for building a powerful dungeon, as well as how you can improve your own defense rates. So before I go any further, I want to provide some disclaimers and assumptions because I don't know exactly how everything's going to work in the future, so some of it's still guesstimation, but I feel like it should hold true. So I believe for the most part we are going to be experiencing only defense and attack buffs for dungeon defenders. We've historically never had power or luck, so I don't really see why they would change that all of a sudden, so we can kind of go on the presumption that it's going to be defense and attack, as well as the health, of course, moving forward. Furthermore, we have the ability to combo dot promote many creatures at the same time. So the idea is that we can now create more interesting compositions than we could have beforehand, because before you'd only try and farm very specific creatures. Now you can farm a wider variety and promote them all up if necessary. If you have enough diamonds, you have enough essences, and enough time on your hands. And in all honesty, instead of rolling in the combo dot summoning event that's happening right now, it's better just promote your cards. Like, take your rares and promote them to 4 dot rares. I think you can do like 2.5 rares for the cost of a multi-summon, and you get exactly what you want. So it's much stronger and much more meaningful to actually use your diamonds in this manner. Now, I also don't know if the 2 boosted colors are always going to be the same combination. So for example, we have white and black now. Will it always be white and black moving forward in the future, or will it be like white plus yellow, that sort of idea? I'm not sure, but it can obviously influence the combinations we have. But it's my hopes that the color combinations vary over time, so that way there's no like perfect or standardized dungeon. It's going to have like ebb and flow. You're going to have like variety, and that's what I think is going to be most exciting, because we want to keep PvP dynamic. We don't want it to be the same. We want to see different defenses. We want to see different creatures being utilized, and having a less standardized format is much more exciting in my opinion. Now, for evaluating these creatures for these dungeon defenses, I'm going to be referencing my tier list, which will be updated very soon to reflect all these changes. But in essence, you want to try and populate your dungeon with at least A tier creatures, especially if they're on color, and then S tier creatures if they're off color. So that's going to be kind of the new change I'm going to have to my formatting. Basically, S tier creatures are now dungeon defenders you would want to run even on off color weeks. And that's important because obviously they bring something meaningful to the table, because like a stat boosted color creature gains so much more viability and potential overall. So having the ability to heavily populate your dungeon, for this example this week, white and black as much as possible, and then a sprinkling of other colors here and there, is much more powerful overall. So at this point in time, I'm actually not running Dungeon 1 because Dungeon 1 is very lackluster. It's hard to really populate it, mostly because we have 2 medium flyers and only 1 medium ground. So the damage is lacking. If it was inverted, so it's 2 ground, 1 medium flyer, it'd actually be has a bit more potential to actually repel attackers. So right now we have the black and white week, and in my opinion this is going to be by far the strongest color combination that we can have, because at this point in time black and white defenders are arguably the strongest anyways, so making them even stronger is quite terrifying for the most part, as well as the fact that they don't have a color weakness. You can go into a white and black team of your own and still get completely smashed, because white still trumps black and black trumps white, so like you're not going to necessarily gain an advantage through color coordination. So if you're an attacker, you may want to start utilizing creatures that are not white and black just for this week, but I'll explain more of that later on. So again, this week is probably going to be where we have defenses experiencing the highest win rate possible, and for myself, I'm actually experiencing a very healthy defense rate. I've climbed mostly just by defensive wins, so it's kind of a strange situation in my opinion. So stat boosts. So stat boosts are providing you with health, attack, and defense buffs to 2 specific colors, and this is actually able to transform like small creatures or even less viable creatures into like quite the powerhouse, because basically they're gaining amazing amounts of stats and they're able to actually punch incredibly hard and be quite scary and lethal for the most part. So for the most part, you do want to try and run stat boosted creatures if at all possible, because again, they have so much more potential overall. Like if I had to choose between a red barbarian or a Clockwork Soldier right now, I would take the Clockwork Soldier just because it's white, it's on color, even though both of them are S tier creatures. Just keep that in mind. So buff and debuff weaving. So no matter how strong your dungeon is, you want to run some sort of buffing or debuffing in order to maximize your output, because that is the single most efficient way to basically bolster your defense win rates. Because let's say you run 6 creatures who have no debuffing or no buffing potential. Sure, it can do some potential damage, but if one of them could buff or one of them could debuff heavily, then your defense rate's going to go up dramatically, because you're basically taking out the 5 opposing creatures with debuffs or boosting all 5 other creatures for your own defense. So this is partially the reason why the statue is reigning supreme, because he can buff and debuff so heavily. And this is why you want to have a nice healthy mix of support and damage dealing characters in your dungeon. Now, you can't just throw in any buffing creature. You want to have buff synergy, because, for example, if you want to run Kitsunes, which are a popular choice during White Week, you cannot just run the default Wyvern for a power buffer because they scale off luck. You need to use something else that can buff luck. So you need to have some creativity when building a strong dungeon defense and weaving these buffs and debuffs in the most efficient manner possible. Now, obviously buffs and debuffs are powerful, but stun is still king, because regardless of what color is being boosted during the week, you still want to run a defender who can stun. And this is because stunning is so amazingly powerful. It stops the attackers from taking an action, it stops them from donating mana, it stops them from comboing, and basically just prevents them from having a chance to clear your dungeon. So with that in mind, Wood Nymph, the Wacky Toad, and possibly the Gnome Crossbowman are going to be almost key cards to always run in almost every single dungeon on floor 1. You need to have some way to stun your opponents coming in, because if you don't, you're going to have a tough time, because they can just take all their actions and just happily go on their way. Maybe one can argue that silence can help solve some of this problem, but stunning is way more effective than silencing overall, because if they're silenced, they can just take an action. They still can basic attack, they still can donate mana. So it's not necessarily achieving the same level of proficiency as stun. So you want to have a stunning creature in your dungeon somewhere, either Wood Nymph or Toad, maybe Crossbowman. So what enchants should we be using? Now, I did write an enchanting guide a while ago, and some changes have occurred over time, but for the most part, there are still several optimal enchants you want to run. And this list here is not an absolute truth. You should take it with a grain of salt. Just use it as a starting or reference point. And remember, if you have a damage dealing creature, you want to use their primary stat, whatever it may be, over whatever is listed here, because, well, you want to be able to deal more damage. That's kind of the goal overall. So again, this is just assuming that we don't know what the stat of the creature that's being buffed. So for the wood enchants, you always want to have health. Like no other enchant comes close from a dungeon defender. Maybe on offense, chance to resist debuffs is a little more valuable, especially on certain creatures, but for the most part in defense, you always want to have health. It's just by far the best stat, universally, regardless if you're a support or a damage dealer. For ore, you want to have the percent mana drain if you're a support creature, and you want to have bonus boss damage if you are a damage dealer. Basically, the idea is you want to be able to drain some of their mana potentially. It can ruin their funneling. If they get stunned, it gets worse and worse. But for your damage dealers, you want to actually be able to punch as hard as possible. And for the supports, like if they're not really dealing damage, there's no point in them actually gaining the boss damage enchant, because, well, they're not dealing damage. Like the runic statue is not going to be hitting, so you want to have that mana drain in its place. For Sulfur, you want to have random stat debuff for non-debuffing supports, or you want to have luck if you're a damage dealer or a debuffing support. So this is the train of thought. So if you're a stat, like the random stat debuff is quite powerful, because if it, say, breaks their defense or breaks their power, it really hinders their ability to function in your dungeon. So you want to use that on supports who are not necessarily debuffing. Like say it's a support who just buffs or just heals. You want to get the random stat debuff on them because, well, that's just where it's going to give them the most value. But on the other hand, if you are a damage dealer or you're a support who actually relies on debuffing, you want to have luck as your Sulfur enchant, because damage dealers have a higher chance to crit, which is great, but debuffers have a much higher chance to land those debuffs, which is kind of their whole goal overall. So you want to take luck over the stat debuff if your role is primarily debuffing. And then for Mercury, you want a chance to double strike if you're a support creature. Again, that possibly can trigger the mana drain twice. Again, I'm not 100% sure, may need more testing. Or critical hit chance if you're a damage dealer. Now, of course, most defenders use power, so you want to use power over critical hit chance. But if you're someone who scales up attack, defense, or luck, you want to obviously use critical hit chance for the Mercury slot. Critical hit damage does not work as effectively on dungeon defense. I think it's still a bit of an issue at this point in time, so don't pursue it otherwise. So now we come to the creature combinations. So this section is going to highlight specific setups that may not be as intuitive. Like, for example, Wyvern plus Skeleton is a very good default blanket choice because Wyvern buffs power, Skeleton uses power, kills a lot of meta creatures, everyone's happy. But again, we want to try and explore other options that are not as standardized. And in general, like, the supportive creatures tend to come in the form of flyers, so your damage dealers tend to be ground creatures for the most part, just because flyers tend to do less damage. Wyvern is the only real exception, and the owl, but other than those two, no flyer really does that much damage, and they're mostly like supports by the nymphs and the statues. So the first combination is Clockwork Demolisher and Wood Nymph. So basically both of them scale off defense, so their buffs help each other do more damage, but the main idea is that Clockwork is probably one of the best, aside from along with Toad, for ground creatures that provide utility and support. But because Clockwork Soldier does scale off defense and does have that stat buffed, he does actually do respectable amounts of damage on defense, especially when their defense has been broken and he's experiencing a defense buff already. So he's going to be doing a row damage that's actually quite significant, while also providing that valuable defense break to allow all your other creatures to basically one-shot something. If the Clockwork Demolisher defense breaks the opponent and then your damage dealer hits them, it's more likely to actually one-shot them outright. And again, Clockwork is hitting the whole row, so basically you're amplifying the damage of all 5 creatures. So it's that debuff is kind of acting as a damage buffing, so to speak. So again, that has synergy with the Wood Nymph, because again, both like defense, it helps each other. Like if the Wood Nymph buffs first, Clockwork does more damage. It just helps each other out significantly. And I'm actually going to be bumping up Clockwork up to S tier again with all these changes. The next is Black Cat plus Mummy. So Dungeon 4, and this is best used in Dungeon 3 and 4, but the Dungeon 4 and obviously Dungeon 3 has you using small flyers. And of course you can use the Monarch Butterfly, which is a good default choice for lots of stat buffing, but you can actually create this very lethal combination because the Black Cat debuffs luck and provides you with a luck buff, and then the Mummy gains 50% more damage against luck debuffed creatures. So this is where it becomes very scary because the Black Cat can debuff their luck, and as well as providing luck. So the luck difference between your defense and offense, like their luck goes down, your luck goes up. So there's a massive luck difference now. So you've already kind of facilitated a higher chance to critically strike just because of the fact that there's a massive luck difference. But the Mummy would be dealing 50% more damage than it normally would. So this is actually perhaps the strongest conditional damage combination in the game. Maybe Kitsune plus Muse is a little stronger, but for the most part, this is one of the highest that you possibly can achieve, and it allows the Mummy to basically one-shot non-white creatures quite reliably because it's going to have innate critical strike chance and much higher damage. This combo is actually stronger than Skeleton with Black Cat because Skeleton already has crit chance. Sure, you can have a really, really high crit chance because of the luck difference, but without that extra 50% damage bonus, having like say an 80% crit strike chance does no good really because, well, it's almost like diminishing returns on critical strike, whereas the Mummy is gaining higher damage and then has a high crit chance already, so the Mummy's actually dealing much more damage. So this is what I've been using in my Dungeon 4, and it's proven quite lethal. Basically, the Black Cat gets to cast first, and the Mummy hits someone, basically everyone's dead. And that's actually quite terrifying, as well as having other dungeon defenders. I've actually populated that dungeon with 2 Mummies and a Drill, as well as the Black Cat, a Nymph, and a Wyvern. So the Wyvern gives the power buff. If I have power buff and the luck debuff, the Mummy one-shots basically anything. It's pretty spectacular. I can't even get through my own dungeons half the time, which is kind of weird. Another budget alternative would be using the Marionette in place of Black Cat, but the Black Cat is a better option because it gives the luck buff as well. But then a Marionette can, I guess, have some fatigue, some power, but we'll see how it goes. The next is Kitsune plus Muse. So Kitsune is the highest damage dealing medium creature in the entire game. If you don't consider any types of buffing whatsoever, Kitsune hits the hardest. And this is because they have one of the highest natural luck stats in the game, as well as scaling off luck for their damage. In fact, they do 360% damage of their luck value, as well as having naturally high luck. So most damage dealers have 200 to 250 range. Kitsune has way higher, so it's dealing like maybe a third to 50% more naturally. Plus, because it scales off luck, you can have the best in chance possible. You get boss damage, you get luck, you get crit strike chance. And because you have such a high luck stat, you already have a naturally high crit chance, so your Kitsunes start taking off and dealing massive amounts of damage. And in all honesty, it's the only real counter to Cerberus, because Cerberus is one of the most powerful attack creatures in the game, but Kitsune can outright one-shot him, even with shrine differences. If your shrines are low lowers, you still can one-shot them, provided your Kitsune at least has luck and chance. So this is obviously very meaningful because you can shut them down, especially in White Week when the counterattack won't actually kill you. But if you run Muse with Kitsune, you actually create a very powerful situation. Muse provides you the luck and men buff to kind of sustain your team overall, as well as Kitsune providing protection and multiple dispels. So if Muse buffs your luck, Kitsune's damage takes off because you have like a 45 or I think 40 or 45% luck buff. So your damage has been increased by 45%. So you're going to start one-shotting non-black creatures at this point, and that becomes quite terrifying, as well as having obviously naturally high crit strike chance, as well as that healing through the mend, which is very important. Of course, if the Muse is the last character alive, you can use it just to charge up your mana and specials, but the idea is Muse will keep everyone alive. If Muse casts a special in the first 5 actions, you're going to basically keep your entire team alive, and then the attackers have no real chance because then the Kitsunes start taking off and dealing massive amounts of damage. So I like this combination, and it works best in Dungeon 5 because you can run 3 medium flyers, and this is the best place to use them. Next is Lizardman plus Pirate Kobold, and this is best in Dungeon 4 or 5 when you can run 3 ground medium creatures. And during water boosted weeks, Lizardman is going to become truly terrifying because you get defense and attack bonuses. So obviously Lizardman scales of attack, so it's important, but the Kobold Pirate grants a large attack buff. So you want to use him and then the Lizardman after. So you want 2 Lizardmen and 1 Kobold Pirate, and then you're going to basically start annihilating most creatures that come through, even if they're not even red, because the Lizard already does such high amounts of damage with naturally high crit strike chance. So the Lizard will, the Pirate will buff your luck, and then the Lizards will start shooting out massive arrows that deal huge amounts of damage. So again, it's best in Dungeon 4 and 5 when you can run 3 medium creatures, because you really want to have 2 Lizardmen to take advantage of the attack buff. And again, I'm trying to use same colored creatures for combinations because that guarantees that they both will have the stat boost and become significantly stronger overall. Next, we have Friar Mantis plus the Gnoll Cutthroat. So Friar Mantis is the highest damaging small creature in the game. It's great to run even in off-color weeks because it provides a power buff as well as a large amount of damage. So it's obviously desirable. But the problem is green kind of lacks strong damage dealers. We have great supports of Wood Nymph and Statue, but Gnoll Thug or Gnoll Cutthroat is the strongest damage dealer in green, and it's worth just mentioning it because you may want to start thinking about investing in a Gnoll Cutthroat to actually synergize with your Friar Mantis during those green weeks. Basically, the Mantis will buff your power, and then the Gnoll will be doing spectacular amounts of damage and also self-healing himself. He's going to work kind of like a Barbarian, but it's just not as lethal compared to Barbarian because there's no double striking, but he can heal, he can debuff, and do large amounts of damage. It's worth mentioning. Then you can maybe say that, well, I can use the green Leprechaun, but the problem is small ground creatures are generally used as toads because toads can stun. So it's harder to justify running the green Leprechaun in place of a toad. Maybe you might, maybe you won't, but again, it's hard to really do so. And then it forces you to either run Dungeon 1, which again is not a very good place to defend from. Now we have Mothman plus Witch. So I know these are off color, but it's kind of just exploring the idea of poison and detonation or bonus damage from poison damage. Because Mothman and Witch both provide AoE poison against the attackers, but then they gain significantly more damage through either bonus percent damage for Mothman if they're already poisoned, or Witch dot detonation. And either way, it's going to provide you with a big damage boost overall, and so you can transform these kind of modestly lackluster creatures into something that's actually quite formidable, especially if you have, say, 2 poisoners on your team. So running double Mothman may sound appealing, but the problem is you're going to have 2 Mothman in your flying slots, and that means you actually only get to have 1 support creature as a flyer, and support creatures tend to be the best from flyers. So that means you have to either run Statue or Wood Nymph. You can't run both at the same time, and that can be a little problematic. And this is why I feel that Mothman Witch is a little better, because you have a ground poisoner and an air poisoner, so that way you can still get the double strong supports in the air as well as other damage dealers on the ground. Because if you start having to use supports on the ground, you're going to run out because you only can really use Toad effectively. Maybe the Leprechaun, but again, we get to that problem of we don't want to run so many small grounds that are not Toads. So just something to keep in mind, and this can technically work in all dungeons because every dungeon has at least one flyer and 1 ground medium creature. Next is Clockwork Technician, and basically he combos with anything and works in every dungeon. And Clockwork Technician is often underrated because the Monarch Butterfly tends to be a little more powerful overall, because Monarch Butterfly gives you a guaranteed buff. However, Clockwork Technician has the ability to provide a massive amount of healing and randomized buffs at the same time. So if he does buff a couple stats, it's definitely worthwhile, but it's that healing that keeps your team alive, because right now during White and Black Week, he is quite formidable. You can't basic attack him down, so he's going to be able to heal up your team to full, as well as providing random buffs. So I found I've used him most effectively on floor 2 when I want to support my epic creatures that have been stat boosted. You can't kill my Clockwork Technician, so he's going to buff them up. They'll do massive amounts of damage, and I'm going to be on my happy little way. So Clockwork Technician is a very powerful card to use with basically any cards, but I feel it's best with your stat boosted epics to keep them alive longer. And now we come to Naga Priestess, and any power scaling epic creature. And as part of my tier list, I'm actually going to promote Naga up to S tier for ground epics, because she has very high single target damage, but the fact that she buffs power and luck is going to enable your team to deal massive amounts of damage. Because yes, she's a threat on her own, but the fact that she buffs the power means that everyone else is going to be doing significantly more damage. So for example, if you have, say, the Naga Priestess and a beetle on the ground, Naga buffs power luck, your beetle becomes so much more terrifying. Its damage is going up through the roof, as well as being able to stun more reliably. So basically, Naga Priestess is enabling every other creature to form or function more optimally. So that's why she's going to be quite scary. And she's going to definitely synergize well with power scaling epic creatures because, well, they can just perform to their maximum potential. So now, how do we counter these strong defenses? So at this point in time, we can still preview dungeons, so we know exactly what your opponents have. So if you have a deep creature box, you are able to essentially kind of customize your team to your liking. Of course, you're still going to probably lose every now and then, but at least we have the chance to preview and build teams that have kind of specific counters. If we know that they're running tons of black creatures, don't even bother bringing something white into the dungeon. Like, you know it's going to die anyway, so just bring a different kind of team and hope that actually works a little better. Because with the combo dot rerolling, we can get exact teams that we want to use, as well as basically avoiding those unfavorable matchups for the most part. But again, things are going to take time to settle as more and more people start building up strong dungeon defenses as they promote more 4-dots. So we're going to have a bigger pool of legendaries possibly to draw upon to mix and match teams accordingly. And so basically, in conclusion, the dungeon challenge meta has definitely shifted. It's a lot more exciting in my opinion. There's a lot more variance because now we can run multiple dungeons more efficiently because of 2 colors being boosted and 2 stats being boosted. We don't necessarily see the exact same setup every single time. And as the weeks rotate for colors, it's going to change and vary. Like the Black Cat plus Mummy combination is incredible on Black weeks, but it's obviously going to be much more lacking during the other color weeks. You might see other things in Dungeon 4, which I think is exciting. Like, I like the variance in there. So it's going to definitely increase the replay value overall. So let me know what you think about the new patch in the comments below. Do you feel that the changes are healthy for the most part, as well as what have you been planning to run your dungeons? Hopefully you all have a fantastic day. Wish you all the best of luck in your own CQ adventures, and happy questing.